So yes, thank you very much for joining us on our webinar. This is on the 4th of February 2021, where we are going to talk about the topic of measuring the performance of a botanical collection. So this topic has first time we sort of had a bit of an in-depth look into this was at the conference in Leiden, where I remember Mats from Gothenburg presented. So there's a video on YouTube on our channel from that presentation. So together with me today is Wahid, Dr. Wahid, from who is going to be the main presenter on this topic. We're going to also include some breakout session at the end and a few polls also to get a bit of a sense of where people are and what people think. So hopefully that will be enjoyable for everybody. I'm just going to quickly see if we just want to see if there's more people in the waiting room here. So okay. So before we start, I would also just announce to the visitors or the audience here that we've had version 5 of the Floria app released yesterday. For those of you who are running on version 4 of the app, you know, that's not a big, you know, not a big problem as such. But now the new features and releases, or new features, will now from now on be installed in version 5. So for those of you who want to switch, you can do that at your leisure. But you need then version 5 of the app manager. The key beyond it being quite a significant architectural change, there is some improvements in performance that especially those with the larger data sets will experience as a benefit from the new upgrade. Other than that, go to our website to see about the new features and then plan your switch when you feel like you're ready for it. But it's not critical to switch, you know, like tomorrow or next week or something. More better to do it timely when it fits your own workflows. Now, so as we said, if you have any questions, as normal, you can either unmute yourself to ask questions, or you could use the chat function, and we'll try to capture that. And then, as I said, we will have a poll and a bit of a discussion, a breakout session at the end of today. So beyond that, I will let Wahid take over now and start the day. Thank you.
Great, thanks Havard, and thanks everyone for joining today. It's good to see you, and hopefully talk about something that's close to everyone's heart, and that is measuring the performance of a botanic collection. So this topic really concerns that of performance measures. And for many gardens, it's important to measure really and demonstrate how well your activities are being implemented. And often there's an assumption that good outcomes will be achieved, but that assumption needs to be tested and reported on at various intervals and various levels. And this kind of information, normally performance measures, these types of data are contained within the vision and mission statements of a garden. And these types of documents, they capture the main aspirations of a garden. So it's vital that the intentions are really clearly articulated right from the outset. So when it comes to visions and missions and strategic plans, these are really key components of a botanic garden and its use of its plant collection. The vision often refers to the aspirations of a garden, and it can be over a number of years or even decades, whereas a mission or a strategic plan usually is a bit more specific in its statement that really explains the aims of the project and the aims of a garden and its collection. So these are really key factors of any garden before we even start to think about performance measures. So we're just going to run a very quick and easy survey for people just to get warmed up. And that is really to ask people, do you have a mission statement in your garden? And do you have a strategic plan in place? So hopefully you'll be able to see that on your screen now. It's a simple yes, no answer for the first one. And secondly, yeah, do you have a strategic plan? So you might have one, you might not, or you might not know. So great if you could answer that while I'm talking. Now, you can see on the right a couple of examples of those from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew and Cambridge University Botanic Garden, who often publish their collection strategy and mission statements online for everybody to see. Will we be able to see the results, Howard?
Yes, I'm thinking we just wait that we have 90% of the votes in. So
okay, brilliant.
I suppose we could say now that's good enough. Yeah, let's go for that. So here we go.
Wonderful. So 85% of you do have a mission statement, and 15% don't, and 50% do have a strategic plan, and it's a 25% mix between no and not sure. So that's really interesting. And what's also really interesting is that the BGCI have very strong opinions on this, and it's a core component of being a botanic garden. And they state that there's actually little point in having a strategic plan unless it is used as a management tool for assessing progress and adaptive management. So that's an interesting thought to bear in mind throughout the course of this talk. So what is success? And how do we define success in gardens? And that's obviously quite challenging for gardens to be able to define that because it's so specific, and common benchmarking metrics are used in the industry specifically for visitation and education. But what does that actually mean, and how do you actually interpret the impact of those visits, for example, or how that is influencing education in the context of your collections? So beyond visitation and education, there are obviously other elements of a garden. There's the scientific, horticultural, and even conservation outcomes that are all part and parcel of the garden and its mission. So these performance metrics and success measures, they have to take into consideration these other aspects of the garden. And importantly, they must also be recognized as valuable by the outside world, especially funders and other stakeholders. And those of you who may have attended the 2017 conference in Leiden, Havard mentioned earlier, Matt's presented this model framework for Gothenburg Botanic Garden, where the three elements of their vision and mission concerns the research focus, the outreach focus, and the pedagogy, that sort of teaching element to their work. And it's often a balance whereby these three main frameworks can often compete and often can be challenging to manage which takes priority and which really deserves a lot of the time in the context of your collection. So basically, it's all important to think about metrics for everybody and metrics for all parts of your collection. And if we think particularly from a plant science perspective, your garden might rely on things like peer-reviewed publications. And if you're engaged in a lot of science work and taxonomic research, it might be publications in journals that are either high impact or just journals generally, or you might be involved in describing a lot of species. And if you do have a lot of publication output, you might be interested in the indices for citations and how well they are cited across other aspects of research. So while this is fine for gardens that are involved in this kind of work, it doesn't really capture the wider efforts that gardens have. So some of the other aspects that I mentioned earlier. So it's very important that success measures are really applicable to all areas of the botanic garden business. I also wanted to remind ourselves really that when we're thinking about targets and metrics, it's important they should follow a principle. And many of you might have come across the SMART principle when establishing goals and indicators. And this acronym is quite simple, but it's actually very useful when you're thinking about goals, in that a target should really be specific, in that it should target a specific area for improvement. It should be measurable, so you should be able to quantify or at least indicate progress in terms of how you're going to measure it. It should be achievable, in that you need to be ambitious in what you're trying to achieve, but also something that will be able to be accomplished. Sometimes that A is also referred to as assignable. So you've got to be able to specify who's actually going to do that. You might also want to think about the relevancy of your target. So when you're stating the results that you can achieve, it needs to be relevant to your institution and the resources you have for it. And finally, T is time bound. So not only should your target be specific, measurable, achievable, and relevant, you need to specify when your results can be achieved. So this could be by a particular date or by a particular quarter or even decade in the case of some missions and visions of gardens. I wanted also to talk very briefly about vanity metrics and actionable metrics. Now, this is a really interesting discussion that we could spend the rest of the hour talking about, but it's often the case that data that are available to gardens and institutions often are vanity metrics, in that they might make you or your collection feel good, but actually they don't really offer clear guidance for what you need to do. So what are the next steps for you? For example, you might have, I don't know, let's say you've got 1,000 hits on your website, but do you really know what actions you took to drive those visits? And do you really know what to do next? So it's having that sort of thing in the back of your mind that these numbers or statistics might look good on paper, but they might not necessarily mean anything important for you. So what I want to get people thinking about is actionable metrics. So these are metrics and measures that link to specific tasks that you can actually improve on, that you can actually tie into the goals of your garden and the mission of your garden and its collection. And I think these are really the only metrics that we should invest our energy into collecting, and it's these that help us make the decisions that are really measuring a means relative to an end. So with that in mind, do keep that thought as we progress today. Another thing that's quite interesting is that these areas for measuring success come in quite broad categories, that in the context of collections and botanic garden visions and missions, that there are actually other areas that are important beyond simply the collection itself. So it might be that gardens have a role in managing sites, so managing areas around the world. They might have a role in managing particular species, and of course that's through ex situ collections and specific garden collections, basically. Also, it might be through research. So we've talked about taxonomic research or systematics research, but it can also extend to other ecology and molecular work that's all linked to collections. There might also be an element of education for gardens. So these programs for visitors that are really to showcase and interpret collections in gardens. Importantly, on the right-hand side, there are three other main areas that gardens have a real value in, but often can be overlooked. And that is capacity building. For example, you might have practical conservation techniques that are often enhanced through capacity building in gardens, so particular practices or horticultural techniques that are only nurtured in gardens. You might also have policy improvements that are influencing all sorts of policies around the world or conservation plans related to biodiversity. And finally, there's that element of livelihoods. So a good example is that of the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, where they have worked with indigenous species and indigenous populations to really enhance the livelihood of people. So it's always good to think about the more broader role of gardens, particularly in the context of conservation. For us, however, we're going to focus on species management, research and education for the rest of today. So how might we measure performance then? Well, in the context of a site or a particular species, as I've mentioned, you could look at the way you're managing the area. So you might think about the number of hectares you own, or the number of hectares you've secured in a particular habitat, or that could be involved in the management or restoration of it around the world. You might also think about the number of people who are using your collections, or the number of species you have in that particular collection. And of course, the number of species that you might have in that particular reintroduction program throughout the world. When it comes to collections, there are a whole host of topics that you could look at. Some of these examples are the number of collections that you've databased or you've documented, the number of protocols that you've developed, so looking at it from a horticultural perspective. If you're involved in research, you could look at the number of new species that you've described, or the number of accessions you might have for a given taxon, which can be a good indicator of the genetic diversity of your collection. And also you can look at things like the number of materials you've supplied to other gardens and what type of material that might be. And if you have other collections such as seed banking or DNA, germplasm, or even a herbarium, you can also look at those as significant parts of your collection and how they are also key in measuring the performance of your collection. I wanted to briefly mention the way Cambridge University Botanic Garden has looked at quality metrics. And I know if Pete's on the call, feel free to jump in, but it's an interesting solution to looking at how quality has been kind of tackled at Cambridge's collections. And there they have looked at these 9 different categories, and that is rarity. So the species that are rare and held in ex situ collections are also kind of really valuable to them in some way or another. It includes things like diversity, whether that's taxonomic diversity, or it could be geographic diversity, which is also important. And I know a lot of gardens try to document that as part of their collections. So not only the diversity of their taxa, but also where in the world they've been collected from. You might also be interested in the origin of the material. So for example, the proportion of your accessions that have been directly sourced from the wild, or yeah, basically that, and also the extinction risk. So the proportion of your collections that maybe are based on conservation assessments and whether they are particularly at risk of extinction. You might also look at seed banking. For example, if you do have the facilities to record and bank seeds, you might start to look at the proportion of your collection that is held in the seed bank. You might look at things like provenance, so the availability of that information. So do you know where your information has come from? Do you know where your collection and plant material has come from? Is there a degree of duplication? So do you have multiple accessions per species, or do you just have one single accession? Do you also know how long your collections have existed? So this gives us a sense of turnover. So how many accessions have come in, how many have gone out, and that can be used as an indicator of the quality of your management of the collection, for example. And finally, plants of exceptional interest. So this can be a bit more subjective in that a species might have a particular value in terms of visitor interest. And the one depicted is that of Amorphophallus, the Titanarium.
Just one to interject on one of some of these things like rarity, and rarity is obviously, to know if it's rare, you need data, and data is obviously captured by other gardens as well. So you need quality data from a global context to decide whether plants are rare in a global context. So some of these metrics are defined by access to measurable data outside your own institution as well. So that's a bit of an interesting challenge, but yeah, just want to add that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so these are all good examples of quantifiable data in some cases. And then when so when it comes to research, some of the things we've already talked about are the number of people that have been trained for a particular protocol or a particular technique. You might look at the number of publications if you're doing a lot of taxonomic or systematic research, the number of species you've described, and things like citation indices that are relevant if you're involved in a lot of publications. And you might even have courses that you offer for people. So you could look at things like the number of attendees as well. And that can be at various educational levels. And finally, when we think about education and awareness, this is a bit more, it can be quite difficult to quantify in some cases. So things like interpretation in gardens. Sorry, could you go next? Thank you. So you could look at the interpretation in gardens. You might look at outreach, which of course is beyond the garden. You might look at education at different levels. So the way you've engaged sort of different education levels like primary, secondary, even university level undergraduates and postgraduate education. You might also think about continuing education levels and other certificate programs. And you could even extend that to the number of symposia that you've hosted at your institution. And finally, these communications that are so important, whether they are peer-reviewed and scientific, but also alternative communications. So these can be simple things like your website and the way you sort of publicly kind of disseminate your collections information. It's also good to think about how you demonstrate sustainable practices in the garden or the way you promote conservation work, not only in your institution, but also for your collaborators as well. And as I mentioned, some of these can be a bit more difficult to quantify, but they're still important in thinking about performance and how we measure it. So actually in 2017, the BGCI International Advisory Council requested that they carry out a technical review looking at exactly this. So the two main things that they were looking at was how a botanic garden actually defines itself. What is a botanic garden? And secondly, how might that botanic garden measure its success? So how does it know it's doing a good job as a botanic garden? So yeah, as I mentioned, this survey was put out in 2017 and was responded to by about 200 gardens across the world, about 50 countries. And it seems that it's actually still open, this survey, but one thing I wanted to talk about was that the results for it were published in 2017, later on in 2017. And they broke down the measures in gardens at an institutional level and at an individual level. And here is just the top 10 activities or measures at the institutional level. So you can see out of the 200 respondents, 87% of those focused on the number of visitors. That was the topmost ranking measure. Then you had events, the income, the number of plant species conserved, and then things like social media followers, which of course also plays a big role in disseminating the information of your garden's collection. And then you've got events, volunteers, media publications, and third-party collection purposes such as research and conservation. So those were the results at the institutional level. And then next slide, we can see the results at an individual level. Now, these are quite vague groupings, but interestingly, monitoring and curation of collections is joint top, alongside the number of school children educated, the number of people trained, and the number of people species conserved. It's not quite clear the difference between the institutional measures and the individual measures, but hopefully that's quite interesting and perhaps somewhat predictable, in at least the case of visitation. That's kind of one of the main benchmarking statistics that gardens use, but there aren't that many examples of very specific collections-based measures, which is something we want to talk about next. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of what sorts of performance measures are currently looked at, and some of the key considerations when you're actually setting about thinking about your garden's mission and kind of strategic plan. And hopefully this has given you a bit of an insight as to what might be interesting for you. But we want to learn from your collections and obviously the value of those collections. So we wanted to run a few questions. The top 2 questions will be a poll. So did you actually take part in this BGCI survey? Were you aware of it? It was 4 or 5 years ago now. And did you contribute to it or have any interesting kind of discussions arising from it? And secondly, are you using plant records to measure the performance of your garden and its collection? And given the way you're doing that at the moment, are you satisfied with it? Is there anything you are sort of particularly happy about or particularly unhappy about? And hopefully we'll give you a few minutes to complete that survey. And what we're going to do now is break into some smaller groups to discuss particularly the last question, which is how satisfied are you? And we're going to roll that breakout for 5 or 10 minutes, and we're going to return, and hopefully some of you can share your thoughts and feelings about that, which will be great.
We'll let the poll finish first so you can see the results before we, I think, yeah, we're almost there. I think we're here now, we can share the results. Yeah, now we're ending the polling. And
wonderful. Okay, so a lot of you not sure about the participation in the BGCI survey. It's interesting. 68% of you are using plant records. That's great to hear. And 32% of you aren't doing, which is interesting. And so it would be really valuable, I think, to hear why that isn't the case. And perhaps you might be able to explain why you should or shouldn't be using plant records. And finally, a lot of you, 42%, are dissatisfied with the way you monitor your collection. in terms of performance. So it will be great to hear some of your thoughts on that. And I think I'll maybe hand over back to you, Havard.
Yeah, so what we'll do is we have now it's 3:33, so we'll let the breakout session last for 10 minutes. So then we can come back, and then each group can sort of share their thoughts about the last question about how satisfied are you, and what you might do with that challenge. So I'm opening up all the rooms now, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. We had 5 rooms, I think, breakout rooms. So Wahid, maybe I suppose the next step now is that people from the one representative have a few share their thoughts if they have anything they would like to share with the rest of us. So if we start with the room 1, where Daniel, Elaine, and Christina, I think. If you have anything you would like to share with the rest of us. Hello, Christina. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you. Elaine didn't have audio, but she was able to share with us at Smith, and Daniel from Idaho, right? Daniel, is that it? Idaho?
Yep.
Yeah. I guess that we were all in different stages, just because of indefinitely the past year has been quite a change in terms of staff and priorities and things. But the collections at Elaine's Garden seem to be developing well. She has a new director who's very invested in the collections and following and tracking metrics. And Daniel also is updating his collections policy to include disaster plan, and those are good steps. And then here at my garden, I track the collections metrics and actively promote and share, but it's really hard to sometimes get a voice when there's so many other interests and are in just competing priorities. So, but yeah, so that was us.
Yeah, thank you. Do you feel like you use the metrics you have as a way of communicating to the rest of the, I suppose internally, but maybe sometimes externally as well? Is that something you are able to do, or?
Yeah, I do in all of our presentations and classes, and then on the website and various, yeah, definitely, like in tours and things.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to volunteer, or we can ask each group? I mean, if nobody don't want to share, that's fine. I mean, let's jump to room 3 here with Åsa, Daniel, JP, and Cherie. I don't know if anybody have sort of the inclination to speak out and share their thoughts.
I'm sort of still waking up on the West Coast, but we did talk about, I did learn about using GBIF as a way of tracking citation data. So that's something that came out of that's helpful for me. Yeah, and we did talk about where each of us were at with using collections as performance indicators. So for us at UBC, we're mostly using taxon based, but it sounds like ACE is a little bit further ahead with that at Gothenburg.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, you should watch that video from the conference in 2017. There's a few pointers there, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, great. Okay, so let's jump to room 4 here with Rob and Sarah McNall from Cornell, and Wahid as well, who is volunteering.
Rob, did you want to mention your system of reporting? It was quite interesting.
You're on mute, Rob.
I think
we have a quarterly requirement to fill in key performance indicators into a horrible piece of software called ESM, which is a executive management package which the whole garden feeds into. So there's a whole lot of different metrics in there. The ones that I have to feed in are the number of taxa, the number of accessions that are growing in particular areas of the garden, and the number of threatened material, and the number of new accessions in the collection that have come into the collection since the turn of the year. The idea being that there are benchmarks. In other words, we know we should be getting in around 2,000 new accessions per annum. Therefore, if the numbers are coming in below that, there is a reason for that, and we need to be investigating or documenting why we are coming in below the expected metrics. For instance, this year and with the COVID, we've not had anybody out collecting material in the wild for a year. So therefore, instead of running it around the 2,000 mark over the year, we're running it around 200 new accessions. Therefore, we want to document that and use the statistics to be able to say, you know, we are 80% down. The reason for this is COVID. Therefore, in the next few years, we would look to try and up the wild collection budget and try and get this material recouped over the next few years, and maybe approach our funders and say, look, this is one of the direct effects of the pandemic. Therefore, are you able to help us try and overcome that? So it's really about benchmarking and using the figures to try and find out where we deviate from what we would expect to have in the collection. And then if we are deviating from that, try and find the causes of that deviation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose also, you know, often the just having the historic data as well is so valuable, I suppose, when you communicate to those who are maybe not as deep into the work that's happening inside the collections, seeing graphs and numbers and trends, you know, regardless of what numbers are underneath, that's sort of like, oh yeah, this is going down, why is that? And yeah. Cool. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Room 5, that was Anna Florence and Emily James and Lara. I don't know if you have anything to share with us, or. Hello, Anna.
I think we only had 2 in our group, so if there are others, we didn't see them, but it was definitely interesting talking to Anna. I think we're both in the same boat. I may be a little ahead of her in that we're really having to really do a full inventory to understand what we have and get our records straight before we can really dive into some metrics. Not really using the database for metrics. The garden as a whole does a lot of education and conservation and, you know, strategic plan just to add more color, more bulbs, various things like that, but haven't really used the database as a metric of where we're going, but really trying to get a full inventory and get everything straightened out so we can in the future.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose the thing to think about there is when you have the mission statement and the strategic plan, then you sort of have an outline of what you should record beyond just the plants and what you have and where they are, so that you can actually get those numbers out. That's sort of the, yeah. But it's a sort of one step at a time. I'm sure. Yeah, it's tricky to. Yeah. Cool. And I think
the additional challenge that we have is. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say the additional challenge that we have is that we're not a botanical garden, we're a heritage organisation. So our mission objectives and strategic plans don't just take in the gardens, we've got battlefields and mountains and houses. So a lot of our strategy is a lot more general, so fitting our gardens into these metrics can be more challenging.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, of course. I mean, we see that a lot. You know, now also we talked a lot about, or the focus was maybe garden with research conservation activities, but historic gardens is one thing. But you have other gardens who, you know, are highly into visitation, and maybe their collection also should reflect that more than they might not have wild collected material. So what are the metrics you want to put in or look for when you want to keep more interest in dissertation and education. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge. But it's funny when you said battlefield, I was thinking, what do you mean? But now I got it. Yeah, that's part of it. Sorry. So I think the last group, Ben and Peggy. So you were the smallest group. Well, also the other one. But did you have any to share? Anything to share?
Hi. Yeah, we were well. We had challenges over communications because of we could only do it on chat. But it was a lot of what other people have been talking about, the issues of reduced staff numbers due to the pandemic and challenges thereof. But also trying to get over to see the end users the importance of records and maintaining them, and how that they can then be used to their advantage. So I think in the short time that we had, we essentially determined that whatever you could put out, you had to sort of cut your cloth accordingly. So so just determine what you wanted from your records and then follow on that way. I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. Rob shared with us this nugget of the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh Living Collection published to GBIF. So that's this is data nirvana.
It's the citations, top right hand corner, that black. There we are. That's the useful bit. It's very hard to influence anybody, and you can't say to people, please include us in your citations. Please include our material in your studies. But if they do, and it's picked up by the automatic citation collection devices that GBIF use, the papers that reference your material do come up in there, and it can be quite useful to show the reach of the collection.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard that might be a problem sometimes. They beg for material and they use it in their research, and then that's it. Thank you very much. Goodbye, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's getting better in that every GBIF download now has a GUID, an identifier, which so that if that identifier is in the published paper, you can link it back to your collection. So GBIF are working hard to try and make it, to tie up all the knots.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's good. That's yeah. Okay, well, that was very. Thank you very much for participating in the discussion. So let's go back to the slides here. I'm just going to try to see if I can find them. Is that here we go?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, no, it's just some closing thoughts really. I know this survey went out 4 or 5 years ago now, and it was interesting to hear that some of you did participate, but others weren't sure. But I suppose what's interesting is that the results are published, and I do recommend you take a look at them. It does go into more detail, especially from a definition of a botanic garden and ways in which you can measure success. And particularly for the BGCI, they're sort of focusing on research and conservation perspective. So if you are a historical cultural garden, it's sort of, there are still areas in which you might find interesting, but yeah, the vast majority of cases it's in research and education and visitation. So yeah, that's kind of some closing thoughts from me. It's really interesting to hear some of the ways in which you're looking at performance indicators, and hopefully in the future a standardized approach might help these discussions going forward. So yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, so what we'll do, what we started to do now is to summarize the webinar with a blog post. So we tie all these sort of references and everything else into a post that will come, not tomorrow, but maybe in a week or a month. It's not like, yeah, we will do that. And then we find very interesting as a general topic. So we probably pop into this topic again in the future, because learning more about, especially what you mentioned, Anna, from these historic gardens and gardens that are not necessarily into conservation research, but they still have metrics. Just understanding what those metrics might be, so that we can look at how plant record system can help to make measuring these metrics and collecting that data easy. So on that note, I think unless there's anybody else who want to comment or share anything before we close off for today. No, wonderful. Thank you very much for joining then. And so our next one is in 2 months' time. So that's in April. We're not sure about what we might want to bring up here, but if you have any suggestions, just email me or Wahid or anybody else at the Botanical Software. So we're happy to dig into any of these type of related topics to plant records. So thank you very much for joining, and see you in 2 months, if not before. Thank you.